Hello, everybody, and welcome to Dry Dock episode 46. And a couple of small bits of channel admin. By the time you are listening to this, the winners for the Designer Battleship competition should have been decided, and messages will be being sent out to them. I'm going to allow a week or two for people to respond, and if I haven't got a response after it's about 2 weeks, then I will pick another winner. So, yeah, it looks like given the sheer number of entries, these competitions are going to have to be bi-monthly, i.e. 6 per year rather than monthly, because there's a truly stupendous number of entries that were received. There will be a kind of outtakes bit at the end of the video that will cover some of the slightly more hilarious designs that were received. But just as a little spoiler, and it is something that means I'm probably at some point going to collaborate with a few people to produce a how to use SpringSharp video. But there were a few rather amusing errors that weren't down to bad design on people's part, but I guess just cultural misunderstanding, and that surrounds the decimal point. Because you see, SpringSharp is designed where the decimal point is a period or full stop, whereas obviously in a number of countries the decimal point is represented by a comma. Unfortunately, in the math system that's used in SpringSharp, the comma is just a number separator. Like for 1,000, you might have 1 comma and 3 zeros, which led to SpringSharp taking some rather creative interpretations of what people were putting in. Like, for example, we had a battleship that was clocking in at 2.5 billion tons, because there were a few commas in the main armament section. We also had another battleship that was 3,000 feet tall. Unsurprisingly, this had some stability issues. And there's another one which I'm still trying to figure out where the error is, because otherwise it looks generally okay. But if you look at SpringSharp towards the end, there's a section about survivability where it tries to estimate roughly how many shells of the same caliber as your main guns it'll need to sink your ship, and how many torpedoes. As I say, I can't quite figure out where this has gone wrong, but something in the math has gone very badly wrong on one particular class, because it suggests that about 20 16-inch shells would be needed to sink the ship in question, which is fair enough. And then it suggests a number for torpedoes needed to sink the ship, which is best expressed as, here is the universe. The universe is very big. Now, the universe is usually measured in billions of light years. Now imagine trying to measure the universe in meters. Now, bearing in mind that your average torpedo is more than a meter long, probably about, so this particular ship, SpringSharp, suggests you would need so many torpedoes to sink it, you could place the average World War II torpedo end to end, nose to tail, all the way across the universe and back over 400,000 times. And this is how many torpedoes you need to sink that ship. Hats off to you, whoever broke SpringSharp's maths. I think your ship is pretty unsinkable to submarines. That aside, Tankfest is now in 2 weeks at the time of you listening to this, and I will be there on the Friday morning and then on the Saturday. I will not be there on the Friday afternoon because after lunch I intend to head into Weymouth to peruse one of my favourite naval bookshops. So if the weather is reasonable, look out for a man wearing a black t-shirt with the channel logo emblazoned back and front. And well, for the probably 3 or 4 of you who might be there, feel free to come and say hi. And that's all I'll say for that for this week. And yeah, shall we get on with the questions? So this week we're taking selected questions from an array of revoiced videos and the guide to the Strozhavoy class destroyers. The sources of information that were used primarily for the video on the Strozhavoy class were Soviet destroyers of World War II, one of the Osprey series, and the Soviet Project 7-7U destroyers article in Warship 2008. And let me tell you, that was a pig of a book to get my hands on. Anyway, Latin Man asks, Drakinifel, could you make a video discussing the naval aspects of the Falklands War in detail? I could, but as I've said before, but probably needs reiterating since it was a while ago, I try to avoid covering warships or conflicts that are still in recent living memory because it's far too easy to get sidetracked into modern or near modern politics. And also, to be perfectly honest, a lot of the operational details of those conflicts and ships are still classified, so there will only ever be speculation and such like for certain aspects of that. So, yes, technically I could, but I'd prefer not to for the minute. A few people raised the issue of KCCCP being used as the Strozhavoy's marker or prefix. Now, as I've covered in responses to similar issues with German ships from the Second World War, Japanese ships from the Second World War, and actually Russian Imperial ships to a certain degree as well, yes, I know that certain navies didn't have prefixes before their ships' names, like HMS or USS, etc. However, this is a YouTube channel. People do want to sometimes look and search for ships by certain designations, quite often country designations. And so I try to give some form of prefix to any ship that I can directly name in a guide. And occasionally KCCCP is used in some literature, the same way that KMS is used in some literature for German ships. Other sources use DKM, although obviously neither of those were actually used in practice. And the same with the Imperial Japanese Navy. Sometimes they use IJN, sometimes they use IJNS, sometimes they use HIJMS, his Imperial Japanese Majesty's ship, etc. It's a shorthand to help people identify within the channel which ships belong to which navies. I think I'm going to persist in using the prefixes wherever I can do. For that reason, if people have a particular issue with a certain type of prefix and would like to suggest another one, then please feel free to do so. Bradley asks, could the Chinese have won the First Sino-Japanese War if they were actually competent, had actual ammunition, and didn't split their fleet into little bite-sized pieces? Now, obviously, there is a whole land war component to the First Sino-Japanese War that I won't go into because, well, land warfare is not my area of speciality, but in purely naval terms, there is the fact that, well, if the Chinese can dominate the seas, then the war's not going to happen because the Japanese need to sustain their armies in China, and for that they need supply routes by sea. So if their navy is sunk or badly defeated, they can't do that, and yes, then the Chinese win. Which kind of means the Chinese have to win the big naval battle, which basically means they have to win the Battle of the Yalu River, as shown here. And yes, technically they could have done. On paper, as virtually any history of that conflict and that particular battle will tell you, the Chinese had far the superior fleet. Different sources disagree wildly on exactly what the fleets were, but generally the broad agreement is that the Japanese fleet was made up of a couple of older center battery ironclads and a bunch of what we would loosely define as cruisers. And the Chinese fleet had a similar number of cruisers, but they also had 2 battleships. So they quite badly outgunned the Japanese on paper, and indeed the 2 Chinese battleships proved incredibly difficult for the Japanese to actually overcome. But they were let down by all sorts of flaws and failings, some technological, most of them human. So yes, let's say if the Chinese had had the same quality of equipment, ammunition, in terms of maintenance, etc., and crew as the Japanese, then yeah, I don't think there's much doubt they probably would have won the Battle of the Yalu River, and then that would have been pretty much curtains for the Japanese invasion effort. Savong asks, who would your choice be to collaborate with to build a destroyer in the 1930s if, like the Soviets, you wanted outside help? Well, if we're assuming for a moment here that we're putting aside all kinds of political differences, so because obviously exactly what political allegiance you have versus the political allegiances of the countries you might go to is going to have a massive factor. But if we're going purely by technical capability, then the choices are actually pretty narrow, to be honest. In the early 1930s, you're almost going to immediately rule out Germany because Germany's only just getting around to building its own class of destroyers, and the Type 1934s aren't that good. Um, the French ships are impressive on paper, but if anyone spent any kind of extensive time at that point actually observing them in action on exercises and such like, they'll realise there's a lot of issues there. The Russians didn't do too badly in choosing the Italians because the Italian destroyers, for all their faults, and most interwar destroyers had various degrees of faults, they were at least relatively functional ships, um, albeit suffering from slight short range issues. And that basically leaves you with the big three: the Japanese, the British, and the Americans. At which point it's somewhat difficult. I'd say probably what you want to consider is what kind of navy are you trying to build? It goes back to that how to build a navy video. If you're trying to construct a navy which is going to be badly outnumbered, then you could probably take some lessons from the Japanese, who are trying to build individually more powerful destroyers. This is assuming you've got your own technology, obviously, because there were some critical fundamental mistakes with Japanese technology. Um, so yeah, assuming that you can build your own version, the design principle of Japanese destroyers is pretty good for a smaller navy that's going to face outnumbering opponents quite often. If your local navy is planning to be as big or bigger than your rivals nearby, then in the early 1930s, I would probably go and ask the British, and I say that purely because American destroyer designs at this time, you're talking about things like maybe the Farraguts, they're serviceable, and arguably they're beginning to introduce superior machinery. However, American destroyers in the early part of the 1930s do have some issues with top weight and stability, and a couple of other problems as well, specifically around a slightly schizophrenic back and forth as to whether they wanted balanced destroyers, gun-based destroyers, or torpedo-based destroyers. And they had reasons for that, but the design principles are a bit all over the place. Whereas the British, at that point, during that period, they pretty much had the art of minor incremental improvement to a general fleet destroyer unit that's solidly sort of middle of the road to lower end of the upper scale of the road, down pretty pat. Something like a EFGH type class of destroyer, perfectly good for most navies. Tyler Griffin asks, have you thought about using World of Warships to help with your episodes? You don't have to play the game. I was thinking more along the lines of using the ship previewer import to show how ships looked, and also the armor viewer and secondary AA camera to get closer looks. So the answer to that is I have thought about it for several reasons. I mean, one is, as you can see here, um, I have quite a few ships in my dock. They just keep going and going and going. And we've run out at last. Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of ships in here, and obviously I've unlocked a lot more. Now, one of the reasons that I do not tend to use it too much is, well, there's a few. So you've got various ships. You've got historical ships. So let's say you have the oldie Hipper class here. Now, for this, there may be a temptation to use this as a kind of, as you say, as a close-up, as a ship model to show what's going on. However, if we go over to, let's have a look at something. What have we got? basically the problem with these ships is that they sometimes have unrealistic refits, so I could give the wrong impression by saying, oh, this is what a ship looks like. Obviously, a certain hull type might represent the ship as it appeared in a certain time period, but equally, they may also represent a ship in a manner that it historically did not have. Now, I'm just trying to find maybe this one. Yeah, so for example, take this. I mean, yeah, this isn't a historically built ship, the old Prince Eitzel Friedrich here, but you can see that even if it had been built, it definitely wouldn't have been built with these things. Um, this is a entirely theoretical later on refit, and quite a number of ships have this. So I wouldn't necessarily want to give the impression that the models are completely accurate. Then, of course, you have ships. You have ships like this, like Prince Eitzel Friedrich here, that were not in fact constructed. Now, these models might be quite useful if I'm doing a video on those, because obviously there aren't photos of a ship that was never built. So obviously, you have things like the old Key here, and one of my personal favourites, HMS Machine Gun. HMS Maxim Gun, I should call this thing. But yeah, so with these things, again, could be useful, but also Wargaming do sometimes tend to put their own little spin on things. Well, Prince Eitzel Friedrich being a classic example of that. So yeah, with real ships, there are occasionally sort of fantasy add-ons with ships that were never built but were planned. Again, sometimes they change things up themselves. And then, of course, you have, now where have I put you? Somewhere around here you go. Here we go. So yeah, and then sometimes you have something like this, which didn't exist at all. Not even paper ship designs. These are, well, loosely based on interpretations of other ship designs, shall we say. So yes, World of Warships is a very fun game. World of Warships does a reasonable job of representing historical, of course, that's the line, historical and near historical, shall we say, ships in a reasonable manner, and can be quite useful. But yes, I don't necessarily want to try and bring it in and give the impression that perhaps this is entirely a legitimate thing. Now, the other issue that I want to pull up with this, if I can remember where I put my Americans. Where are you? Come on. Nope. Here we go. Montana, no. Ah, there we go. The other thing is when you talk about the armor section is, yeah, so here's the armor. Let's switch that bit off. My other concern with this kind of thing is that although most ships that really did exist do tend to start off with armor layouts that were something akin to what they historically had, there are issues, especially with ships that have been changed for game balance, and stuff like this. I mean, this is an abstraction. This isn't actually a real thing. The superstructure of an Iowa class is not a uniform 19 millimeters, and as I say, the exact layout of ship's protection does get changed for game balance purposes, even though the model might be accurate to a historical time period. So yeah, that's a slightly long-winded way of explaining why I don't tend to use World of Warships, except for maybe the occasional purely visual reference. SSE Western, and again, shout out to one of the earliest subscribers onto the channel, asks, What do you think of big-gunned submarines, with notable real ships like the M-class and Surcouf coming to mind, but also some of the US designs that incorporated multiple 8-inch guns? Although ridiculous sounding, would these have had any at all usefulness in war? And well, perusers of obscure naval trivia rejoice, because there on screen is the initial design blueprint for an American, and yes, you're not reading that wrong, armoured cruiser submarine with the same kind of firepower as the average treaty-era heavy cruiser. That is, eight 8-inch guns in 4 twin turrets, 2 super firing forward and 2 super firing aft. Always add more gun, America. Always add more gun. Anyway, so this design, plus things like the M-class with its single 12-inch gun and Surcouf with its 8-inch guns. Yeah, they're an interesting one, aren't they? I think for me at least, they're one of these things that look very, very stupid now, and to be perfectly fair, the M-class was probably fairly stupid from the beginning. But the various designs that were prepared, and some of them, like Surcouf, realised with the sort of cruiser caliber weaponry, were not necessarily entirely stupid. By World War II, technology and tactics had vastly overtaken them, and they would have been incredibly vulnerable. But you've got to remember that most of these submarines were designed in the 1920s, when anti-submarine technology was somewhat more lacking, shall we say. And the idea of a lot of these, some of them were designed as fleet scouts, which that involves the whole fleet submarine idea, which is just silly. But a number of these were designed either with a primary or secondary purpose as commerce raiders, and in that role, it's not actually a terrible idea, because one of the things that navies of all nations found in World War One, but the Germans especially, since they were the ones doing the most commerce raiding, was that submarines tended to run out of torpedoes fairly quickly, and torpedoes are quite expensive weapons. So using even one of them on a merchant ship is, well, if you can avoid it, you'd prefer not to. Firing an entire spread and watching the merchant ship sail by completely unharmed is really gutting. And this is why a lot of ships chose to surface, a lot of U-boats, sorry, chose to surface and use their deck guns, hence the invention of Q-ships. This was kind of an attempt in some of these gun submarine designs to circumvent that, because no merchant ship armed with a handful of pop guns, sort of 4-inch, 3-inch guns that could threaten your average submarine, would be much of a threat against a submarine that could surface and engage from considerably longer range with considerably heavier firepower, but can still carry an awful lot more 8-inch or 6-inch or 5-inch shells than it could ever carry torpedoes. So, as a long distance commerce raider that could spot merchant ships pop up, make them stop, or just attack them outright, there's a certain degree of use for them in a theoretical war in the 1920s. So, yeah, they might have been useful. Obviously, the British counter to that, since they were the ones under submarine attack the most, was the convoy system. But you could even make a certain argument that the mere existence of a small number of these submarines would actually force the convoys to be considerably more expensive and more difficult for the British to organise, or any other nation that you're attacking for that matter, because whilst against a normal submarine, sloops and destroyers are perfectly adequate escorts, and obviously later corvettes and frigates. If you're talking about the 1920s, if you've got a submarine, especially like this one, that's not going to cut it. And nor actually are a lot of the light cruisers. You're going to have to carry something, take something with you on the convoy that can fight one of these things on the surface, or at least present a major threat to it. And that means either a modern light cruiser or what would later become a heavy cruiser. That's a lot of resources to invest in escorting a convoy, especially in an era like the 1920s, when significant sized cruisers with this kind of firepower weren't really that common at all. So once the Navy starts doing that, or maybe they start using older battleships or something, then you have to go back to torpedoes, and that's a lot of empty deadweight. but the sheer resources you might force an enemy to expend by the mere existence of a handful of these kind of submarines, especially if they score one or two major successes, might well make them worth it in a war of the time. But as I said, unfortunately, that particular concept and that whole tactical paradigm kind of went by the window by the time World War II actually rolled around, plus the fact that at that point the only heavy gun submarine left was Surcouf, which was not fighting against the British, and the Germans weren't really known for much for their heavy oceanic convoys. Hater4321 asks a number of questions about ships' canvases in the late Victorian era and Great War. He believes they were used to confuse enemy rangefinders. Additionally, different types of paint used in the late Victorian era and start of the Great War. And finally, why so many pre-dreadnoughts and ships of the Great War had so much rigging and such like. So with regards to canvas, it could be used in a couple of ways. One of which, as seen here, is to completely hide the profile of a ship. Yeah, questionable ability to work, but it certainly presents a rather confusing profile compared to what you were used to. The other thing that it could be used for, as so helpfully modelled here by one of the US Navy's finest, are all those little triangles. These are called rangefinder baffles, and they were developed by the British in the run-up to the First World War, and to be perfectly honest, were a classic case of designing a countermeasure to your own weapons and not your opponent's. You see, there were two kinds of optical rangefinder used during the Dreadnought period: coincidence rangefinders and stereoscopic rangefinders. Basically, how they work is they exploit two different forms of optics. A coincidence rangefinder presents two halves of an image, and then you have to line the two up, and by lining the two up with dials, that then gives certain angles of the two different prism mirrors that you're using to generate those two images, and those angles can then be read to give a range, because you're basically aligning the two to point in the same direction, but from different points. This was what the British used, and a number of other nations also used it, and when you were doing that, obviously, if you're trying to line up two halves of an image, having a nice straight line, like, say, a mast, makes it very easy to line up. This principle is also found in quite a lot of old 35mm film cameras when you're trying to establish what range and focus you're looking at. Now, the idea of these baffles was to basically prevent there being any clear straight lines on the ship, which then meant that if you're trying to line up two halves of an image, you're going to have a rather interesting time of it, because everything's going to be lined up in various ways, shapes, and forms, and you're going to be looking around going, I have no idea whether this is lined up or not properly. It may be, it may not be. Fire, and then you'll probably miss. The single greatest problem with this particular idea was that it only works on coincidence rangefinders, and the Germans used stereoscopic rangefinders, which is where you take two whole images and you try to overlay them with a mark on each prism, and then you basically have to overlay the two whole images, and when the two marks coincide, you know that you have established a triangle, and then you can read the range off. Similarly, in actual fact, having more distinct shapes helps with a stereoscopic rangefinder, so rather unintentionally, these kind of baffles actually make the job slightly easier when you're using the German style of rangefinder. Now, the next bit is about paint, different kinds of paint, different colour schemes used, and why they chose it. So, for example, this here is a colorized image of the Great White Fleet. Now, certain navies, if you look at black and white photos, then illustrated colour illustrations from the period, and colorized photos, you'll notice a wide variety of different paint schemes from different ships of different navies in the sort of late Victorian and 1900s era. This is what they call their peacetime paint, and it's basically what the nation's fleet high command decided would make their ships look very nice, and would also make their ships look very distinctive to basically so that everyone else could look at them and go, oh yes, instantly. I know this is an American ship or a German ship or a French ship or an Italian ship or a Russian ship or a British ship without having to get close enough to see the flags. Hence the use of the term Great White Fleet because of those big white hulls. Almost invariably, this tended to run into the theme of painting the hull one colour and then painting the superstructure another colour. There were variations and additions to it, but this was generally how it was done, and it tended to be one of two choices. Either people went for a light colour on the hull, as per America and Germany, for example, and others, and then you'd have a darker colour on the superstructure. With white, this was usually some shade of brown, tan, or yellow. And then if you were going to flip it around, as with, say, the Japanese Navy or the Royal Navy, you would go, or the Russian Navy, actually, for that matter, you would go for a darker coloured hull with a lighter coloured top. So the sort of the more buff and lighter yellow sand colours would be used, or white would be used on the superstructure, and the hull itself would usually be black or some other sort of dark grey or something along those lines. So yeah, that's basically what they were for, is to look pretty, look good, and say, look, I'm a very important ship from this very important country. And lastly on this question, when we're talking about rigging, as so beautifully modelled here for us by the French battleship Bouvet, the masses of rigging you tend to see on late 19th century, early 1900s era warships serves a multiplicity of functions, actually. Well, as you can see here, it also serves a very useful laundry line function. But no, more generally, there was the fact that a lot of the ships were only just removed from sail. The last cruisers that included sails were still being built well towards the end of the 19th century. Battleships obviously had ditch sails a little bit earlier. But the masts that were there were they still needed to be there for things like spotting tops and flying the flag. But before the advent of things like tripod masts and lattice masts, the traditional mast structure still required a fair bit of rigging in order just to keep itself upright, stable, and in place, especially during high seas and the kind of speeds that ships of this period were now capable of getting up to. On top of that, you needed lines specifically run signal flags from, because apart from the occasional use of a signal lamp, the main form of signals between ships was still hoisting of flags. Then above and beyond that as well, you had the advent of radio, and so you needed to string aerials for your radios, and where better to string those than, well, in places that were already designed to have large amounts of cable strung between them. So hence the proliferation of rigging in the warships of this period. As the tripod and lattice masts get invented, you suddenly see that amount go down dramatically, because apart from a few stabilizing lines and the flag and well, you don't need much, if any, stabilizing line on a tripod or lattice mast, and so what's left is usually a very light rig and flag and radio aerial lines, which are relatively small comparatively. Now moving on to the more general questions. DF asks, how do the Gato or Gato class of subs stack up against their contemporaries? Well, as submarines, leaving aside the fact they had the misfortune to have to be issued with the Mark 14 for a couple of years, the Gato class, as I covered in my video on the subject, actually stack up fairly well against their contemporaries in the design role that they were made for. This is an important thing to bear in mind with submarines of the period, because operational environments for different nations were radically different in many cases, and so it's not necessarily fair to compare the Gatos or Gatos with just a randomly picked type of submarine. You can certainly make comparisons with, say, the Japanese A-type submarines, or with the British T-class submarines, or some of the larger U-boats. But if you try and compare it to, say, a U-class submarine of the Royal Navy, that's not a fair comparison, and because they're designed for completely different mission profiles, and the things that you might think make a U-class significantly inferior to a Gato in terms of the fact they're a lot smaller, they carry fewer weapons, their diving depth isn't necessarily as great, actually would work badly against a Gato in the kind of environment that the U-class was actually supposed to operate in, and that was shallow water environments like the Mediterranean. So yeah, in an environment like the Mediterranean or other coastal waters around Europe, the North Sea, stuff like that, the operational parameters for submarines are very different from the operational parameters for a submarine that's designed to fight in the broad open spaces of the Pacific Ocean. So with that in mind, if you compare the Gato class or Gato class against their specific contemporaries, which I mentioned at the beginning, they generally stack up pretty favourably, especially once a variety of minor wartime modifications were made. Most importantly, improvements to their dive time, i.e. the time it took for them to go from a surface condition like this to a completely dived setup. Seric, I think, says, in regards to the 16-inch Mark I, that's the guns used on HMS Nelson and HMS Rodney, how were none of the flaws of the lightweight high-velocity shell concept not discovered before it was too late to go back to the drawing board and it was already installed? Were there any plans to design newer, heavier shells in the interwar period? And if there were, what happened, or if not, why not? If any hypothetical new shell had been designed, how would it have been able to increase the gun's performance? So the whole lightweight high velocity shell concept was derived initially from research that was done using captured German data and equipment after World War One, where the Germans, to a large extent in their own fleet, had gone for lighter weight, higher velocity shells in order to try and achieve superior armor penetration. And, well, as anybody who's done basic physics in school will be able to tell you, kinetic energy equals 1/2 mv squared. So the amount of kinetic energy you get out of an increase in v, or velocity, is proportionally significantly greater than if you simply increase the mass, which is m. So this is effectively where the underlying concept comes from. Now, at close range, this is perfectly true. If you have a gun firing, let's say the same gun, we've got a 12-inch 45 caliber gun. If you use exactly the same charge and you fire a heavier shell, it's going to go slower. You fire a slightly lighter weight shell, it's going to go faster. Assuming the shells are equally strong at close range, the lighter shell is probably going to punch through slightly more armor, assuming that you're making relatively efficient use of the explosives if from a normal weight shell perspective, purely because, well, it's got more kinetic energy behind it. There are, however, problems with this. One is a lighter weight shell, by necessity, is going to be slightly weaker. Two is the fact that the lighter weight shell is much more easily influenced by environmental circumstances, wind, air currents, moisture levels, etc., which are all actually major factors when you're talking about engagements over 10 plus miles. Then you've also got to take into account that, well, simply put, momentum is also a thing, and so is air resistance. And given that the profile of the shell is not going to be any different, because 12-inch shell, or in this case a 16-inch shell, is going to be exactly the same width, it means that a lightweight shell over long range slows down considerably faster, and therefore at medium to longer ranges will hit with a lower velocity than a heavier shell will, and therefore will penetrate less armor at those kinds of ranges. There's also sort of a corollary to that, is that the lighter weight shell with less inertia and momentum is more easily deflected, which is not a good thing. and this is one of the reasons behind the development of the US Super Heavy shell, because it carries its momentum better at longer ranges, and therefore will hit harder at longer ranges. The other thing to factor in to the kind of long range fire paradigm when you're talking about lightweight versus normal weight or heavyweight shells is that at longer ranges, because of their initially higher velocity, they tend to travel in a slightly flatter trajectory, which means that if you're trying to fight at long range, their intersection with the deck armor is probably going to be at a shallower angle, which makes it easier for them to skip off the deck. So, yeah, there are a number of disadvantages to the lightweight shell profile. Effectively, the only real advantage you get out of a lightweight shell compared to a normal weight shell is at close range in terms of armor piercing. Anything beyond a close range firefight, you're better off with a normal weight shell, or possibly a heavyweight shell, depends on the profile of your gun. And now, part of the reason this wasn't picked up before it was too late is, as we've covered in other videos, naval guns are pretty much the longest lead item when you're building a battleship. So, given that the research had to be done in 1919, 1920, and into the early 1920s, by the time they'd done the research, they decided that this was possibly the way forward, and then gone and designed the gun, designed the shells, got them all under order, under construction, etc. Yeah, that was all done fairly quickly, and then by the time someone turned around and went, hang on a minute, and figured it all out, then everyone else was kind of like, yeah, little late on that. We could have used knowing that a year or two ago. Yeah, that's basically why they ended up the way they did on Nelson and Rodney. Now, as for whether or not the ships could have had a heavier shell, apparently one was considered and designed for the 1930s, but it was cancelled on the grounds that so many good ideas that the Royal Navy had in the 1930s were cancelled, namely, we don't have the money. But then again, to be perfectly fair, much as I hate to say it because I have said it a number of times before, just ask Bismarck how lacking Rodney's projectiles were. So, on to the Discord questions. An angry American asks, armor for warships is a very complex topic. Yeah, no kidding. And the best armor changed with time and the existing threats. So, from 1900 through to the end of World War II, what would you call as the best armor for battleships that were going to be fighting other battleships, say pre-World War I, during World War I, into war, and into World War II for time frames? Well, there's two layers to that. Obviously, there is the actual armor, as in physically with the metal, and the armor layout. So, in terms of armor, the metal, I mean, right at the 1900s, you still got a lot of ships using Harvey steel, and then Krupp armor comes in. So obviously, Krupp is superior in pre-World War One, in the pre-World War One period. Exactly what the quality of different armor types during that period in World War One is much of a muchness in the most advanced nations. The American Navy hits a kind of a sweet spot in defeating 14-inch shells with some of its standard type armor plates in terms of the sort of the thickness and the graduation from hard to soft. So, say, yeah, during the pre-World War One, it's kind of a pass. Really, it could be anybody, depending on batch quality. During World War One, the later US standards probably pulling ahead a little bit there due to the proliferation of sort of the 12, 13, 13.X and 14-inch weapons. Then in the interwar period, you start to get technological advancement. Obviously, no one really built any battleships during that period, apart from the last few before the Washington Naval Treaty. And then when you're into war, you're talking about sort of the treaty era battleships, the 1930s. At that point, material-wise, British and German armor has made material property advances that other nations don't make. for the rest of the battleship period, so their armour is superior, and that goes kind of well into World War II, except for the fact the Germans obviously have great problems trying to make any armour when everyone's bombing them flat. Now, that's just in terms of physical armour properties. In terms of armour layout, that's a whole different kettle of fish, and to be honest, it's very difficult to make any kind of definitive call, at least from my perspective, at least until the latter stages of World War One, and that is because you have a whole plethora of different enemy gun types that you might be facing. So if you're facing off against the British, there's a fairly high chance that you're going to be facing, certainly into the Dreadnought era, 13.5 and 15-inch shells for the bulk of that kind of period. Whereas if you're facing off against the Germans, it's going to be 11 and 12-inch shells. And if you go winding slightly further back into the 1900s, for the British, you're talking about uniformly 12-inch guns. For the Germans, you're talking 11-inch guns and 9.4-inch guns. Obviously, the Americans are also rolling around with the 12-inch guns. So there's a lot of differences in the kind of gun you might be meeting, and therefore shell performance. You've also got to take into account different nations' philosophies on ammunition mixes, secondary batteries, whether you're going for more numerous ones or heavier ones. What kind of shell types they have. Obviously, the British have CPC, and also the weird kind of faults and foibles that exist. So, let's say taking for something like the all or nothing armour scheme, brilliant in principle, definitely the way forward, but for the first few years of its existence, kind of the World War One period, you could actually make a technical argument to say the all or nothing armor actually has some dramatic flaws against the shells of that time. And I say that purely because you have two things. No, three things actually. So one of which is that, as Jutland shows, German 11-inch shells actually can't penetrate that much armor at long range because they're small caliber in the first place, and being lighter weight than average, they lose velocity. So you get things like the 9-inch armor on British battle cruisers actually quite happily holding up against 11-inch hits. So you could make an argument that at the longer ranges, a kind of distributed armor system might still have some protective advantages, whereas with an all or nothing, a shell that size and of that weight and of that speed, by the time it hits, might actually penetrate and detonate within the ship, which would be bad. Related to that, you have the fact that around the time of Jutland, and obviously immediately before and immediately after, British shells have a habit of almost near enough exploding on contact. So the idea of minimal protection, meaning the armor-piercing shell would pass through your ship, would happen if the shells were working properly. But since they're not, there's a very high likelihood of British shells getting just far enough inside the ship that when they detonate, they do a horrific amount of damage, albeit obviously outside the armored citadel. And related to that, the British at that point still have the CPC shell, which is, as I've said before, is kind of like a hybrid between armor-piercing and HE. And against an all or nothing battleship, a CPC shell, assuming the British knew of the armour layout and chose to use that kind of shell, could make a real mess of it. But those are edge cases, and in two cases rely on the fact that the shells don't actually work as everyone thought they would. So, yeah, all or nothing. Let's say way of the future, possibly a few weird edge cases to why it may not be absolutely perfect during World War One, but most of those cases are not cases they could have reasonably foreseen. Getting to the end of World War One, in terms of armour layout, obviously now all or nothing is very definitely needed because almost everyone's fixed their AP shells, and the AP shells have gotten considerably larger, so you need a lot of very thick armour. The penchant of the American battleships for having exceptionally thick turret face armour was probably a relatively good thing for the 1920s, given that the ranges are still going to be shorter than World War II ranges and would obviously always tend to close. And as Bismarck found out during its final battle, medium to short range heavy gunfire with anything that's not a monstrously thick turret face can result in some rather spectacular loss of main armament. But during the interwar period, you also have the advent of inclined armor. That's definitely a superior system. It gives you greater protection, especially at medium to long ranges for a given thickness of armor. Some designs use that to compensate for the fact the armor's not particularly thick in the first place, which is, I mean, it's understandable, and it does improve your level of protection to something akin to more heavily armed ships. HMS Hood is an example of this, but it's not ideal. Whereas as you compare it to something like Nelson, where if you incline already very thick armor, that gives you hilarious equivalent thicknesses. Albeit that the Nelson's belt is relatively shallow, but I've said before, not particularly major flaws with that. So the ideal kind of armor scheme, well, the ideal armor scheme probably arises when you're getting into the late into World War II timeframes, the kind of armor scheme that you might see used on. It's not entirely perfect for South Dakota and Iowa. I would say probably the perfect armor, well, not perfect, but the best armor scheme that finally emerges from this whole development cycle is probably the Montanas. Because in terms of general armor, the Montana combines all of the best types of armor. So you've got very thick turret faces, you have a single thick deck, which is far superior to many spaced decks, you have angled belt armor, but the thickness of the belt itself is substantial and good in the first place, which means that then your equivalent thickness and protection levels go up quite spectacularly. So yeah, the Montanas I would say are probably going to be what I would rank as the best armor protection scheme, and that's not necessarily in terms of thickness, but I mean obviously they are one of the biggest battleships ever actually designed and begun construction. So you would expect them to have very good armor, but the principles of the armor scheme used on the Montanas, I would say, are also generally one of, if not the best. Cogs and Spigots asks, why did torpedo bombers all have crews of 3 when dive bombers and other light bombers only needed a crew of 2? Now, this answer is in theory, because in practice, quite often torpedo bombers would often leave out one of their crew members in favour of extra fuel. But in theory, and to a certain extent in practice, the reason that torpedo bombers generally had crews of 3 was that you had a pilot, and obviously that's in common with, well, any plane and dive bombers and such like. You would then have a rear gunner for defense purposes, and most dive bombers and such had this as well. Now, the difference is that with torpedo aircraft, which tended to be slightly larger anyway, the third person would be an observer, or dash navigator, etc. Now, one of the reasons for this was that obviously lining up a torpedo attack is a very multifaceted function with regards to having to worry about the enemy ship's bearing, course, your bearing and course, your altitude, alignment, airspeed, etc., etc. And so an observer was basically there to help out with all of that, plus take some of the load off the pilot's mind, and the pilot just had to worry about following a few instructions and making a few judgment calls. With a dive bomber, you don't have to worry about a lot of those factors so much, and weapons release is entirely in the pilot's hand because, well, he can see the target in front of him, hopefully, whereas that's not necessarily the case depending on how you're launching your torpedoes. So yeah, it's basically workload share in the middle of an attack. Although, as a number of swordfish veterans noted during the attack on the Bismarck, to a certain extent, an experienced pilot could take over that role entirely, which is why as I say, during the war in favour of things like extra fuel and such. Quite often the observer's position was deleted. Spartan 515 asks, if the Japanese could have any of the following three, not losing so many of its carriers so quickly, retaining its highly skilled pools of pilots, or having had consistent developments in naval aviation to keep them more or less on par with the Allies rather than fielding rather obsolete Zeros toward the end of the war, which do you think would have changed the war the most and the least? The least, assuming that the other two remain pretty much as per historical, would be not losing as many of its carriers, because carriers can be replaced. Um, and, well, pretty much as the Japanese found out by the time you get to something like the Battle of the Leyte Gulf, you can have as many carriers as you like. If you don't have the aircraft and you don't have the pilots to put on them, they're pretty useless. So yeah, if Japan keeps more of its carriers, it doesn't lose them as maybe they get damaged rather than sunk and then can be repaired. If they're still losing pilots at the rate they lost them historically, and their aircraft don't keep up in the same way that a lot of them didn't, then it's not going to make a tremendous amount to the outcome of the war. It just means that the Essex class is going to rack up more kills than the pre-war Yorktowns and Lexingtons. In terms of the most impact would be the retention of their highly skilled pilots. Now, obviously, having more and more widespread advanced aircraft would be nice, but the simple fact of the matter is, as any combat pilot will tell you, the skills of a pilot make or break an awful lot of engagements. Now, yes, if the technological disparity is far too much, then that can be a deciding factor in a battle. But where the technological disparity is not awful, then a good veteran pilot in a slightly substandard aircraft will still hand a green pilot in a technically superior aircraft, just completely hand him his backside on a plate almost every single time. And I mean, we've seen historically throughout the history of air conflict is that even when you've got decently trained pilots in on paper superior aircraft, if they come across a slightly inferior aircraft but it's being flown by a really good pilot, they can have an absolute pig of a time trying to put them down. And that's where the technological and numerical superiority is vastly, vastly greater than the gulf between, say, a mid-war Zero and a Wildcat or a Hellcat. Tamron asks, did French battleships with quad turrets have problems with shell dispersion? Yes, they did. However, thanks to rather abbreviated gunnery tests as a result of World War II breaking out, they didn't have enough time to realise this before it was time to go into action. And when both of the completed, or in the case of Jean Bar's case, semi-completed Richelieu class went into action, they had rather more pressing concerns, such as their guns self-destructing. I mean, you think Prince of Wales is bad in its engagement with Bismarck, with guns going perennially on and offline. At least you could actually bring those things back into action. Richelieu, in its attempts to fire back at the British at Dakar, managed to literally destroy 3 of its own guns in one engagement. So, yeah, not brilliant, and a much bigger problem for them to sort out than relatively minor issues with dispersion. In the end, however, they did fit delay coils to the turrets, but this was a post-war innovation which reduced the dispersion by about 40%, which was a good thing. And finally, Dunkmaster Flex asks, with regards to secondary batteries, do you think having a larger battery of smaller but faster firing guns is superior to a smaller battery of larger but slower firing weapons for general purpose anti-surface work, e.g. 6-inch versus 4 or 5-inch? To be honest, it depends on 2 things. 1, what is your most expected anti-surface target, and 2, what is the time period that we're talking about. We're specifically talking about anti-surface stuff, so we're excluding the anti-air threats, so our arguments about dual-purpose weapons, etc., can be put aside for the minute. So one of the reasons that secondary batteries increased in caliber was for concerns about stopping destroyer attack. and basically as destroyers went up, the secondary battery size went up, and this was primarily rigged around the idea, at least in most of the major navies, that you wanted to be able to stop a destroyer with a couple of hits from your secondaries, because they recognized that the secondary battery accuracy was not necessarily going to be as great as the primary guns. So if you weren't going to get too many hits, you had to rely on getting the few that you did actually stopping the destroyer cold. So you saw a fairly rapid escalation from the 12-pounders on HMS Dreadnought up to 4-inch guns on most of the British 12-inch gun dreadnoughts and some of the 13.5s, and then up to 6-inch guns by the time you got to the later 13.5-inch dreadnoughts and the 15-inch dreadnoughts. Now, it has to be said that that particular caveat and design choice was made in the run up to and during World War One, when the secondary guns, although they were quick firing, were not especially quick firing and accuracy was fairly low. So I would say, given that you also have a potential secondary use for engaging cruisers and maybe even other battleships at close range, although you are verging into dangerously pre-dreadnought territory there. In the World War One period and the immediate predecessor period to that, you probably want a slightly smaller battery of larger, slightly slower firing weapons on the basis that you're probably not going to get that many hits. So if your choice is scoring one pretty devastating hit or 2 or 3 damaging but not crippling hits, you probably want the single devastating hit, and hence a 5 or 6-inch gun is probably the better choice. Now, once you get into the interwar period and thereafter, things get a little bit different because the rate of fire of the smaller weapons, especially sort of something in the 4 to 5-inch range as opposed to the 6 inches, increases rather dramatically. And on top of that, you've got a secondary issue of, whilst destroyer size continues to escalate, battleship displacement, on the other hand, has gone way out of the window. Now, proportionally, actually, displacement increases for almost the same. So you've got a destroyer starting off with a few hundred tons, ending up at the mid thousands, up pushing 2,000 for most of them. So you're talking about maybe 150% increase in displacement. And when you compare something like HMS Dreadnought or USS North Carolina at sort of 16 to 18,000 tons to a 35,000 ton ship, you're again looking about double. But not inverse square cube law, sorry, the proportional amount of, well, the physical amount of volume on a 35,000 ton battleship is massively greater by sheer volume compared to destroyer, which for obvious reasons, because it's just physically smaller. But that means the overall size of a sort of a treaty battleship and thereafter is its ability to absorb damage basically has gone up considerably more than the ability of a destroyer to absorb damage, and most destroyer weapons are in that 4 to 5-inch range, trending towards 4.5, 4.7, and 5-inch weapons. Larger weapons on destroyers tend to be relatively impractical for a variety of reasons. Now, if those are your primary destroyer weapons at least as far as guns are concerned, and they're quite able to take out other destroyers, and you're in a situation which you would be in the 1930s and thereafter, where your secondary batteries can be assured of a relatively decent degree of accuracy, and there's fewer battleships to start with and potentially more destroyers, and on top of that, say those shells still are kind of viable for stopping enemy destroyers, and you can be relatively guaranteed to hit multiple times thanks to your improved fire control. I'd say then in the late interwar and going into World War II period, you probably actually could be justified in scaling your secondary battery down somewhat. Because if you run into enemy cruisers, the displacement difference between cruisers and battleships has grown so much that your main battery guns will just blow them out the water. You don't even need to really worry too much about secondaries. And with your more accurate fire control, having many faster firing guns is probably going to allow you to smother destroyer at that point, which would not necessarily have been the case 20 years previously. So yeah, I think if I had to draw a line, I'd say 1925 and earlier, you probably want a 6-inch secondary battery or equivalent in your local navy. Post 1925, and with the trend getting stronger and stronger the further along you go, you probably want to have larger numbers of 4.5, 4.7, or 5-inch guns. So yeah, that would be my conclusion for that. That brings us to the end of Dry Dock episode 46. Thank you very much for watching, and if you're watching it during the weekend that this episode is released, you may be interested to know that whilst you're watching this, I am probably either having my head beaten in or beating somebody else's head in with a sword, and no, that's not because of some very strange weird fight club, or you might call it that. No, I will be doing a full weekend of medieval reenactment and hopefully not drowning in endless amounts of rain and mud, because I'd much rather keep that for the World War I reenactors